kind of isolated in a room, and sometimes you may feel like you're alone or you're not progressing as much. I think this is a great time for you to kind of dig in and listen to some various recordings from various styles that I think would benefit your overall playing. So I don't know if we can go to the next slide.
Sure.
So I put this. I had this from another meeting. We can probably skip this, but obviously this was just for this class, virtual classroom. I think we all know good etiquette. But if you do have any questions, do comment in the chat, and we'll save some time at the end to answer as many of these as we can.
Yeah, and if you do have questions that arise as we're talking, feel free to go ahead and enter them in, and we'll get to them one by one.
Let's see. All right, let's go on. So, what is the difference between hearing versus listening? And actually, we can, if there's anyone that wants to chime in from the Peanut Gallery, kind of make this a little interactive.
I gotta get my chat screen up. Sorry. And okay. Well, we can go ahead and we can talk about that. I thought it would be helpful just to kind of discuss that right off the bat as to what is listening, and I think maybe one thing to say at the beginning is that this is just the thoughts of the four of us, and there's not really one right way to go about listening. It's kind of an individual thing. But Johnny, do you want me to continue with the?
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I think we talked about hearing versus listening. Hearing is really a physiological phenomenon where the sound waves that surround us are literally hitting our eardrums, and we can't help but hear things. And then psychological is really what listening is really a psychological phenomenon where we actually are paying attention and with intent, kind of processing that information. So Johnny created this really cool chart here that shows kind of how we can think about listening versus hearing. So Johnny, if you want.
Yeah, so obviously you have two sides here. So the hearing is what we say is passive. It's something that just happens automatically, and it refers to the act of perceiving a sound through the ear. This does not require a conscious effort, and this is involuntary, meaning that it just happens automatically. You don't have to do it yourself. Whereas listening is more active, refers to the act of making a conscious effort to perceive the sound, and requires a conscious effort, and is more voluntary.
Right. And so we'll go into this a little bit later, and kind of I think the ultimate implications of what we're talking about with this difference. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a composer named Paulina Oliveros kind of towards the end. But basically, yeah, we're talking about, we experience music in our everyday lives in so many different situations. Often music is something that is more of a background effect, or like something to create the mood wherever you might be, in a store, in a restaurant, or anywhere. In a movie, I actually just watched a movie the other night that had literally no soundtrack to it, and it's a very different experience. In that sort of situation. And then, of course, listening is something where we are actively involved, as Johnny said. So
it's funny you bring up movies, because everyone's been watching probably a lot of movies during this time period, but it's funny, my 8-year-old daughter, I think she's becoming more aware and listening, and we actually went through all the Star Wars series just recently. And now she's starting to learn about film composers as an 8-year-old, and she can kind of hear the style of John Williams in Star Wars, and it just happens because she watched 9 movies in a row. She's starting to get her senses are activating, and she is listening versus them doing passive hearing. She's actively listening. Mm-hmm. And then just 2 nights ago, we started the Harry Potter, which also is John Williams. And now she's starting to put the connection, like, hey, this kind of sounds like Star Wars at times. And it's like, there you go. There's the the active listening in action. So I thought that was kind of cool that my young daughter did that. So
Very cool. Okay, so yeah, then there's just another Cliff Notes version of what we just talked about. Um, so let's talk about maybe why listening is important. I think, Johnny, I don't know if you want to start this one off, but I think for me, listening is important. On a personal level, but also from a teacher's perspective, which I can say something about. But maybe, John, if you want to kind of start us off with this topic.
well, I think listening. If you just only play your saxophone, you're really kind of doing a disservice to the music. Early on, you start playing etudes and exercises, and that's great. But you don't really start developing a voice for yourself until you start listening to to other things out there. For instance, I really feel like a turning point in my career was about the time I was in eighth grade or ninth grade. Prior to that, my first 3 years of playing saxophone, I didn't really listen to saxophone music or really any music for that matter. I was just busy like, I was just trying to be the best saxophone player I can be and doing my exercises and competing at middle school all-region band and whatnot. But, I remember asking a question. Oh, the question was when I was in eighth grade and I got my one on my solo and I was like on Handel's Adagio and Allegro, and I was like, man, I'm the champion. There's nothing more I can do. And then I asked, so if this is a one, are there any like harder solos? And then my teacher at the time, who was his name was Jason Bird, he was a graduate at University of Houston. He comes over with the sheet music and just puts on my stand, bam, doll concerto as an eighth grader. I was like, oh, okay. And I saw these 30-second notes, and I was like, oh man, I can't do this. So I was like, this is a class one solo too. I was like, I'd rather just stick with the Handel, Adagio, and Allegro. So, but he introduced me to, I believe at that time it may have been a Hemke recording of early on, like kind of a bootleg recording of a Doll Concerto. Listening, and I remember just hearing that the tone quality and the sound, and it definitely was something I had not heard before to that point. And I was able to start making connections. Say this is something that I'm not really sure what it is, but I like what I'm hearing, and I kind of want to start going for that. And and obviously I didn't play Doll right away, but I can also remember the next year once I got another private lesson teacher, I started studying with Karen Wiley at the University of Houston as a ninth grader. She introduced me to some music recordings by Jean-Yves Formeau. That was also the same year I started listening to John Harl saxophone concertos, and I think that was also kind of a really neat thing because, they play with the Academy of St. Martin's in the Field orchestra on that recording. And I just remember listening to like Glazunov and Debussy, and just listening. To me, I would still argue that's one of the best orchestral recordings of the music we have, regardless of how you feel about John Harl in his solo playing as a saxophonist. I do think the orchestra that accompanies him is actually maybe one of the best recordings out there.
Yeah, so I think maybe what we're talking about here, on a very fundamental level in terms of why is listening important is because it helps us form our own sound concept. In terms of like what do we want to sound like, and so it's important. We're going to go through more specific examples of the people that we really think are important to check out, which is part of the title of this presentation. But the more of those people that you can check out, and the more that you can expose yourself to, and I will very strongly argue at the end, of course, as we all will, to not just saxophonists. The more you can expose yourself
Right.
to, the more rich your sound palette can be, and the more possibilities you are aware of, and different things you can bring into your own playing. Very, very, very important. Eric or Jaymee, do you guys have any things to offer on this topic of the importance of listening?
Go ahead, Jamie. I'll let you go first.
Um, not only like talking about this is important to be listening to recordings, but also just to make a comment about listening to yourself. I find like as a teacher, a lot of students, they play things and they don't realize what they're playing. Like they don't actually hear themselves or hear what they're playing. It's kind of like a going through the motions thing. So on the flip side of this, I think it's really imperative to actively and objectively listen to yourself while you're practicing, to have an awareness of what you sound like, as well as what we're talking about here as an awareness of what you want to sound like, so that you can bridge point A to point B. And
That's a great point, Jaymee. And I think there's a tendency to approach our music making, especially when we're young, just like anything else that we would do, any task that we would do in a very kind of workmanlike fashion, and just an action that we do rather than something that's really truly special, in terms of making these sounds, right? So, Eric, what do you have on this?
Yeah, the only other thing I wanted to add is that it's not only does like developing or listening develop your music, your tone and the ideas you want, but it also develops your musicality and your phrasing. There's a lot of times, and I was like Johnny Salinas a lot in high school. I learned the notes and rhythms, and I was just going to play everything exactly perfect, and that's how I was going to play. And then one of my high school teachers gave me my first saxophone CD, which was Dr. Mock's Bach and the Saxophone CD, and I heard what an actual phrase sounded like for the first time on the saxophone. And it totally changed the way I thought about music, and it inspired me. I went to go study with him after that, so it was like a life-changing thing like that. It's just how you develop your musical foundation.
Yeah, and if I could take a trip down memory lane as well, my high school teacher, I was very lucky to have a great high school teacher, Reginald Jackson, and I remember we would stop lessons occasionally, maybe if I just wasn't getting it, or if he just wanted to illustrate a point or something like that. I remember we used to just go into the listening room, and he would put on a record of Pavarotti, or some opera singer or some violinist or something like that. So those were very, very formative moments for me when I was a young middle and then high school student, taking lessons with him, and I still think about that all the time when we're talking about these topics. So but let's get into some ideas about how to listen. So we already mentioned we're trying to be active and not passive in our listening. So again, I'm going to get into like the ultimate implications of this being a little bit of a meditative act, maybe in its ultimate conclusion. But Johnny, do you want to start us off on this one?
Well, I say listen actively and not passively. I mean, for the most part, and we can agree to disagree. I would say for the most part, all of us like commercial music or popular music, and I would say 99% of us, when we do listen to it, we listen in a passive way, for enjoyment, and maybe some people will listen actively to some of that, but it's just kind of the nature of some of these commercial musics. I think when you approach classical music, or any kind of art music, I do think you have to be aware of what you're looking for. And so I said pay attention to, and I meant to put a blank there, because we'll talk about, I think Eric will talk about what to listen for in a few slides ahead. But, there are elements of that we should be listening to, so I don't want to give that away yet. But I do think it's really important, if possible, to go ahead and try your best to listen to live music. Well, easier said than done, especially during this time of COVID-19. So go to live recitals and concerts. If we had been in person, obviously, this is why most of you guys come to Great Plains Saxophone Workshop, to have the chance to perform, but also listen to your colleagues and your friends. I think this is what makes this camp very special year after year. And hopefully next year we'll be back, in doing this live and inspiring each other and working together. But if not, and obviously we're not during this time, choose a professional recording from a credible site. And so I had mentioned Spotify or Apple Music or YouTube with caution. I say that just because YouTube can be a great place. The handout I've prepared for you guys, or we all prepared for you guys, you'll notice that each artist has a link to it, and so I do link to one YouTube recording, and I've actually gone through every single one, and so I think they're all good recordings. You just have to be careful because anyone can post on there. You just don't know if it's a good, what their credentials are or anything. It could just be an eighth grader, a young student playing a solo piece or whatever. And I think that's maybe an issue. Going back to where I started, where I think the younger generation, because of things like YouTube, because of having things convenient, people will only search for a particular song, and then that's as far as it goes. So if you're playing Pedro Iturralde's Pequeña Chardas, they'll search that online, find a recording, and then just kind of stop there because they got one recording and maybe that's enough, for them. But I challenge you to try to find as many professional recordings of something because you just never know, what other interpretations that could help your own musical growth. So.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to hear multiple recordings of the same thing. Go ahead.
If I could jump in here, sorry, Johnny. And I think a big part of what we're talking about when it comes to this topic, and I've had the same thing happen where, students will listen to a certain recording and they copy what they hear on the recording. What they're copying is an interpretation. You know what I mean? So it may not always be the correct interpretation. So I liken it to a game of telephone sometimes where, you get this transmission of information from this one performer, and then you perform it like that performer, but it's not even the same maybe as that performer. It's a little bit different. So, but is the performance actually stylistically correct, or is it even good? That's the question. So we're talking, I think, ultimately about developing our own sense of good judgment and good taste when it comes to listening to these things, and you've got to be very careful. Especially when you're younger, I think, in listening to stuff and knowing what's good and what's not good. So we always, talk about, getting good recommendations, which we'll discuss in a second. But the last thing we had on there, of course, was, it's important to support the artists that you like and that you like to listen to by getting CDs directly from the artist, and we're not just saying that as a shameless plug. But
Right.
Another good thing about CDs, of course, is there's always liner notes that will enable you to learn more about the music you're listening to. So, but I think, are we ready to move ahead?
Sure.
Okay.
So the next point I was going to say, and I'm, people know me, especially, I'm kind of tech savvy, or I claim to be at least. But I do think it's super important when you are listening to this type of music on good quality headphones or good quality speakers. Just because, the detail that goes into some of these recordings, especially if it's done well, you can't get that on Apple your AirPods. The AirPods are really convenient. I use them a lot when I work out. But when I'm listening to, very art music, I'm listening to like either these cans I'm wearing here, or I have some Klepsch, very nice monitors or whatever that I listen to. It makes a big difference. I had one student this year, especially once we were in quarantine, I recommended my students get headphones. And I just recommended like a good pair of like $70 AKG headphones, semi-open. And he said that was his very first professional headphones he ever bought. And he said immediately when he put it on, he could hear the low strings and the bass and the music he was hearing that he had never heard before because he had never had good equipment. And it doesn't have to be expensive equipment. It just has to be something that gets the job done. And that might be another discussion down the road. But if anyone needs recommendations, any of us, I'm sure, can recommend some to you guys. Obviously, YouTube has plenty of recommendations. But what I find that's been really good for me, especially right now, is finding some semi-open back. And that's what I actually purchased these here. These are Samsung SR850s. And what I like about this is I can be listening on the computer to something, but also have my saxophone here and practice, and you can actually get some of your own saxophone sound into your ear, as opposed to having something that's completely closed. Then when you play saxophone, it feels very, very muffled, and nobody likes that. So I've been a huge fan of these headphones, and I think these are like less than $50. You can get them on sale, and they're great. I was listening to Joe Lulov's recording of Maslenka a couple weeks back, and it was awesome listening on these headphones. But anyway, we can move on.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So our next point is, just the idea of listening to recordings with an open mind, and all kinds of music that we listen to, everything is going to sound a little bit different, and so we need to keep that in mind and to be open to, what serial music might, do for us as listeners versus romantic music, something we're more used to. And I think Johnny made a good point here in the next bullet, which is, you really need to listen to recordings many times in some cases before you can fully understand the music. And I find the best recordings for me are the ones that I can go back to repeatedly and that offer something new every time I go back and listen to them, that I hear certain things that I maybe didn't hear the same way before that. And I've definitely felt personally, and I think this is how it should be for all of us, is that your listening and understanding will go through a lot of growth phases, different kinds of growth phases that will evolve as you grow as a musician. And I can just give you an example. For me, I'm a performer that plays a lot of contemporary music, and I remember when I was a master's student, I heard the piano concerto by a Hungarian composer named György Ligeti, played by Winston Choi, who is an amazing pianist, incredible player, incredible musician. I believe is chairing the piano faculty at Roosevelt University in Chicago, and at the time, I was at the concert and I listened to it and I was like, okay, it didn't really strike me one way or another. And then a couple years later, I started getting into Ligeti's music, and many of you guys know the bagatelles that are played on saxophone quartet. Once I started getting into Ligeti's music, that piece became one of my most favorite pieces and was kind of my gateway into other kinds of contemporary music. So I think it should be the case for all of us that we hear things and we continue to evolve our sense of listening, and that we grow as musicians through that listening. And I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that, but we can keep going if you like.
Yeah, I guess
nothing, I will go. Okay. All right. Johnny.
So after listening to multiple recordings, hopefully you will start differentiating between soloists, composers, performers, orchestras, chamber ensembles, different recording eras, performance styles. Like I said, I think the more you listen, the more you become aware of your surroundings. And once again, it takes time. You're not going to be able to learn all the different styles, but in one listening. But it takes time. I think year after year you should be expanding your knowledge on various types of music. I know that was the case for myself. I feel even now, as a professor, I'm still learning every day. I'm still trying to listen to something new. And I also think what I try to do, what I've been doing lately is I always try to listen to something new, and I always try to listen to something old. I'm always trying to go both ways in both directions. I think there's some people out there that are always pushing new music and everything new, and of course we need to be doing that, but I also think it's important to not forget performers of the past, repertoire of the past. And so I'm also going back towards older music as well with my own students and me personally, because I do think there's something to that, and I think it's important to honor those they put a lot of time and effort into pushing the saxophone where it is today. And I think it's, I don't know, irresponsible to forget these people, that we really should be listening to them as often as we can. And like I said, I think a lot of these players that have gone, that are long gone, or whatever you might call it, you may not agree with the way they sound in today's modern age, the way we sound as a modern saxophone player, but you should be able to identify it. Like if I was to play a recording of obviously Marcel Mule, I mean, you should automatically know what he kind of sounds like, his use of vibrato, and maybe you don't agree with that the usage today, But I still think it's important to be aware of, performance practice and historical context. I mean, obviously we know. I mean, if you're a Marcel Mule history buff, I mean, you should know. I mean, he was really trying to make the saxophone sound like a violin. That was his big thing, and his vibrato. That's why it sounds the way it does. In hindsight, you shouldn't shame him because it sounds, funny or whatever. I mean, if it wasn't for him, I mean, a lot of this, and other people as well, which we'll see on our list coming up. Everything kind of happens for a reason and progresses to a point in our history where, where we're taken seriously as a classical instrument, and maybe that was part of the reason.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I think this illustrates is that, this is a big part of how pedagogy is formed and shaped over the years. And yeah, even if you may not play the same way that Marcel Mule does, right, at every moment, that sound and that approach, that immediacy of musicality that I think is really inherent in a lot of those earlier players, Marcel Mule as well as violinists, contemporaries of him. That's something that will be available to you should you feel like you want to play in that really urgent way that I feel like he does. So if you don't mind, Johnny, I'll move on to the next bullet point, which is, of course, through all of these things, what we're asking you to do is to extend your listening network by, first of all, you've got the internet, of course, that we've already talked about, but also actively seeking recommendations from people you respect and trust, so your teachers, your friends. If you are in the jazz community at all, this is like a favorite pastime of jazz players, just sitting around and talking about, have you checked this person out? Have you checked that person out? So that's kind of why I changed the title of this this talk of what to check out, basically, right? So you've got to use that network of friends, teachers, etc., and also use, of course, the network that technology offers us in terms of YouTube. If you're listening to a recording, maybe a mixed piece with saxophone and some other instruments, maybe you hear a really great clarinetist or something, and you say, wow, that person was amazing, I want to check that person out. And that just sort of like, one thing leads to another in terms of what we're talking about with the network here. So, is this Eric's area?
Yep.
Okay. Eric.
Yep. So this one, I'm just basically, it's a slide to help you figure out how to develop that good judgment and good taste, and what you want to listen for and what you want to sound like, with just a couple of things to focus on. So the first thing, overall feeling. This is something that will change over time with every single recording that you listen to. Like we were all saying before, you'll listen to things multiple times. You won't just listen to something once. As you listen to it again and again, you'll find new things, and your overall feeling will change. And then you can decide what your first impression was and how that changes after multiple listenings. Also, the sound quality and color, and what you can take away from that. Whether it's like Johnny was saying, Marcel Mule with that very distinctive vibrato, or Don Cinta with that voicing sound, or Sigurd Roscher with his open chamber mouthpiece and large bore horns, something like that. Whatever you want, whatever listening or whatever the sound quality is, whether you like it, whether you dislike it, why. You don't just want to say, oh, I don't like it. You need to figure out why you don't like it. Try it out, see if you like it, and if you don't, that's not too bad. Articulation, intonation, phrasing, time balance. This is all things to just listen for. Articulation is especially important when you're doing transcriptions, whether classical or jazz. This is what can really take a transcription to the next level. Yes, you need to get the notes and rhythms right, but are you following Charlie Parker's bebop or bebop articulation, or Cannonball Adderley's as well? Or if you're transcribing a trumpet player like Miles Davis, yes, trumpet players can do this. Their valve glisses. How do we make that sound happen on the saxophone, and how do we change that? Intonation is a big one too. If you listen to a lot of string players, you will find they use a different style of intonation called Pythagorean tuning that makes their scales sound so natural on the violin, or on the cello, or on the viola. And also, you can listen to saxophonists and be like, okay, are they playing with just intonation? Is that third 14 cents low, or is or are they playing with a piano and their third needs, like, it's a unison with the piano, needs to be right down the middle, 0 on the tuner. Other things to really pay attention to and how that affects the sound. You can listen to one recording that plays everything is right down the middle on the tuner, and then one that plays with just intonation, what you like about it, what you don't like about it. And then phrasing is a big one too. This is what I was talking about, developing your musical foundation, what you want to listening is really how you figure out what you like in music. What are other performers bringing out in the music, and why are they bringing out? Is it harmonically important? Is it motivically important? Something along those lines. And then overall, you just want to figure out what is it that you like or dislike about the recording, and what can you take away from it. Say you're listening to Marcel Mule play, I don't know, what's one of his famous recordings? Glazunov?
Eber or
something. Or Caprice in Forme de Valse. That's one of my favorites of his. Are you taking his tempos? Are you taking his breath marks? Are you taking anything like that that you really like about it? Maybe not his vibrato. Maybe you will have his vibrato. It's a really old French piece, so maybe you'll like it there.
I like to always go back to that. My students have heard me say this a million times, but the idea, I think Michael Brecker is maybe one person that's credited for this this saying, but the idea of the 3 levels of artistry being imitation, assimilation, and innovation. And so, trying to imitate as many different people as you can, try to model your sound or your vibrato or your phrasing or whatever after that, model recording or, something like that. And then once you have achieved that level of performance, if you've done that on many different levels with many different players, then you have, such an incredible variety of options to choose from when we're playing different styles of music. And that's where you maybe can combine, some vibrato that you heard from a great flutist, let's say, with, the beautiful tone of a cellist that you love, and et cetera, and that becomes your own, your own sound and your own interpretation when it comes to making music. Not saying that you should merely copy people all the time, but in terms of showing us the way, it's a good vehicle for learning expression and developing your own musicality.
Yeah, and like you just said, that imitation really helps you develop your own voice in the music.
Indeed. So we developed just a couple of, and Noah, yes, we will get to some recommendations for vocalists for sure in just a second. But first, we'd like to take you through just a couple of easy listening exercises. And these are some things that I wrote down. We've all heard this before from our teachers, but it is more the norm that in my experience, that people don't do this enough. When you're preparing your solo literature, for example, if you're getting ready for a jury or solo ensemble or something, you really ought to do repeated listenings of your model recording focusing on the piano part, or if you're playing a mixed chamber piece on non-saxophone parts. This is simply not done enough, and I've had it, where students they just didn't know that happens at the piano at that point in time, and so then, they miss an entrance, or, they're not listening for their intonation with the piano or something like that. So, it's going to enrich your knowledge of a piece, to an incredible degree, to know the other parts as well as your own. And the same thing goes for saxophone quartet playing, I would say, is, paying attention to the other parts as much or more than your own. I think in H2 at least, and Eric, I'm sure that you have experienced the same thing, and Johnny too, in Amethyst, where the times that you do your best playing and the times that you feel that you own the performance and own the music are when you're not even paying attention to your own part practically, that you're just playing and listening to your colleagues in the group. I think you guys would probably agree with that. And Jaymee, in your jazz ensemble, is probably listening for the same types of things, right?
Yeah,
for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's a cool feeling.
Yeah. And then, of course, in band and orchestra, we've all had to sit through long rehearsals, sometimes where we're not playing for long periods of time. You can do active listening in those moments too, and really pay attention to, balance and attacks and things like that. And you can learn a lot, even if it's what not to do. I think, it's really a great way to kind of keep yourself engaged in long rehearsals if you find yourself in that situation. And then the last thing I put on there is, again, kind of getting into some of the stuff I'll discuss in a little bit. Next time you're in nature, or maybe just bored somewhere, or if you're sitting in your backyard, if you get out into nature at some point, listen for how many distinct sounds that you can hear at any one time. Like, there's never actually complete silence, no matter where you are, unless you're in, like that crazy sound room that they developed up in was I think the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where it's like negative decibels. But see how many different sounds you can hear, whether it's just like maybe the hum of air conditioning if you're inside, or maybe some bird noises outside, or the sound of the wind. It's really, again, getting attuned and aware of what's going on around you in your environment. So I don't know if you guys have anything to add in terms of listening exercises. Jaymee, I don't know what you do when you're working with jazz bands, or maybe with your ensembles, if you have anything to offer on this topic.
As far as listening to multiple recordings of the same tune, I think in jazz, there's such a plethora of recordings of the same piece, and it's done so many different ways, different styles, and even tempos. There's less structure and, I guess, kind of restrictions on the performance of the piece. And so, when we're learning a tune, especially like with the combo stuff, it's like not big band, but more of just like combo playing. With my students, we research multiple recordings of different, not just saxophonists, but like different horn players as well, and styles, and then kind of pick and choose, like, what do I like from this player, what do I like from this player, and kind of make it our own. And so listening is a very important aspect of preparing an arrangement, because that's basically what we're doing. Is we're in rehearsal, we're creating our own arrangement of the tune that we're going to play, and making it our own.
Indeed. And that maybe gets us to just the next slide here. And this is something that I thought I would offer, just because it's something that I've kind of become more aware of and interested in. There's a composer who's very important to music in the United States, especially experimental music. Her name is Pauline Oliveros, and she just passed away a couple of years ago. But she developed something called a deep listening practice. And I could just briefly kind of describe what that is. But Pauline was an accordionist. She played accordion, and she's also, and again, very important to the development of experimental music in the United States. And basically, what happened was she started to get involved in experimental music when she started to go out and make field recordings in the 70s and 80s. And eventually she found herself going into a cistern, which is very, very large, deep metal structure, and there was like a 30-second echo, I guess, in the cistern. And so she made a whole album called Deep Listening based off of that experience. And so she coined this term, deep listening, which she called basically a pun. And the definition, as she says, it was an aesthetic based on principles of improvisation, electronic music, ritual, teaching, and meditation. The aesthetic is designed to inspire both trained and untrained performances to practice the art of listening and responding to environmental conditions in solo and ensemble situations. So that's a really long description, but I think basically that description, along with everything else we've discussed today, is really the idea of the fact that when we play music with people, we're really entering into a relationship with them in terms of the people that are on stage, but also people in the audience. And if you think about the reactions, that you've had with people that you've played for, or people you've played with, they can be very highly meaningful experiences to all people that are involved. And so that's part of what this idea of deep listening is. And so she talks about, she's actually got a book called Deep Listening that you can see here, Composer's Meditation and Sound Practice. So for her, it's very much deeply linked to meditation. And so she talks a little bit about that, and again, being a little bit more fully present in the sonic moments we experience can be hugely advantageous to us and give us even deeper meaning when it comes to making music together. So, in case you're interested, that book is available online. But a couple of other things I just put on here on this slide, just the fact that listening informs so many of our other senses, in terms of our distance between people, our sense of time, and all that stuff. And if you think about, being in a performance, maybe in a big concert hall, if you've ever seen like the Chicago Symphony, or being in a big concert hall with a group like that, your senses are very much heightened, because you're just in that environment, in that experience, and it's something that I think if we can try to develop that practice, that's going to be something that really does a lot for our development as musicians. So let's get on to actual recommendations for recordings, which is part of basically the handout that's on the website. This is sort of a more of an overview of that. But Johnny kind of started putting this together along with Eric, and then Jaymee and added a bunch of jazz recordings at the end. So we can start off maybe with some of the early saxophone recordings here, Johnny, if you want to pick it up.
So yeah, I once again, you find early recordings and you try your best to go, backwards as far back as you can. And, I remember being introduced to the music of Rudy Wiedoff in college. And I remember maybe it was Jeff Leffert or someone ended up finding the re-release CD with a bunch of all of his recordings that were digitally remastered and whatnot. And of course, if I'm sure everyone in here has listened to some Wiedoff at some point. If you haven't, that's what this is for. Definitely take a listen to some of that, because it's great music from the 1920s. And it's just really, really fun music that I think we all can learn from. But two other people you may not be as familiar with, Francois Combel. He actually was late 1800s, early 1900s saxophonist in the Garde Républicaine in France. So he was one of the soloists with that band and played various solos. He has one of the earliest recordings of the Carnival of Venice. I'm not sure if there may be one. I don't even know if there's one earlier than this. I think it's one of the earliest ones we can find. I think this is a great representation of that time period. It probably recorded in the 1910s, probably somewhere in 1916, 17, around that time period. Another one that you may not be familiar with is this Jules Viard. I thought this was really neat. He has one of the earliest recordings of Debussy that still exists, Rhapsody, and I put that link on there, and you can find that on YouTube. And interesting enough, he was probably a little bit earlier than Marcel Mule, and Marcel Mule, I don't know if there was some sort of beef or rivalry between those two, but he talked a lot about his use of vibrato and doing some reading. Apparently, Jules Viard, at that time, he didn't use jaw vibrato. He actually took the instrument and shook it in order to do the vibrato. This is at least according to Marcel Mule. But at the same time, he was one of the first people to do a lot of classical music at that time period. But he also did a lot of slapstick material. And he could have been influenced by the music of Rudy Wiedoff. The slap and laugh is something that very much sounds like Wiedoff, but was obviously happening in France, during the 1920s and early 30s. So that's a really neat recording for you guys to take a listen to. If we have like a minute, it would be really well. If not, you guys can do it in your own. But check out the Saxophone Sobs link that I posted. What's really, really cool about that I found, someone actually recorded them listening to this on a phonograph cylinder. So you can actually see the original cylinders rotating on the player and actually listening to what Rudy Wiedoff sounded like in 1917 if you were to listen, put yourself back in that time period. It's pretty neat because, of course, some of us see record players and obviously it's a really neat acoustical phenomenon, but seeing it on the phonograph cylinder is something else because you just don't see that very often. So definitely check that out when you have after this class during your lunch break. Yeah. And then of course we start getting into the early kind of father figures of the early 20th century classical soloists. Marcel Mule, Cecil Leeson, Sigurd Rascher, Vincent Abato, Daniel Defaye. I mean, these are names you should know, and we've already mentioned Marcel Mule. Obviously, Cecil Leeson was an early American saxophonist, taught at Northwestern before Fred Hemke did, and then finished his career at Ball State. Sigurd Rascher, I mean, of course, we all know his contributions to the repertoire, to Altissimo. I think that recording there is an excerpt from Eric Larson's concerto, and it's live. So if it was available, I try to find some live recordings so you can actually see him play, because there is something to that versus seeing, obviously like just listening to his recordings. Like going back to what we said, if you can see a live performance, it's always better, because then you can start seeing how the performer actually interacts. I think there's very few actual live recordings of Charlie Parker playing, but I think it's something cool to see. And that's the magic of YouTube. So, but you have to search. Some of those are not easily, it doesn't come up right away in the search. So, hopefully, some of these can kind of guide your search. And then we get into kind of mid-century. Jean-Marie Landex, Eugene Rousseau, Frederick Kempke, Donald Sinta. So, kind of the American father figures from the mid 20th century. All of us, most of us in here have been influenced by, one of those three teachers, Sinta, Hemke, Rousseau. And I mentioned this probably once a year at Great Plains Saxophone Workshop, that, all of us are tied to one of those people. So, it's really important to kind of keep up with that, your lineage and your heritage, your saxophone heritage. Because I think now, once again, with YouTube, we're starting to see a lot of like cross-pollination of styles and lineages. It's maybe not so it's not so easy to tell if this person studied with this person anymore. I think back in the 90s, I could easily say, okay, that's a Hemke student. That's a Rousseau student. That sounds like a Sinta student. Nowadays, I don't know, and maybe you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like it's almost like we're kind of coming to like a point where everything kind of sounds the same. And not in a bad way. I mean, everything's very, very high polished, but I think that we're starting to lose a lot of some of that individual characters that you got more. And like I said, maybe it's because of there's a lot more information that can be shared. I don't know if you guys want to chime in on.
Yeah, I think it's partly like it's a result of or maybe an after effect of having all these different recordings, and if everyone is modeling their sound off the same recording, then you kind of end up, all sounding like that. But I think it is partially that. I think, the recording, just the advent of the recording industry at the beginning of the 20th century, fundamentally changed how we receive and transmit music, and how we, everything that we're talking about basically changed with the advent of the recording industry. So it's maybe one of those byproducts of that.
And I know we're pressed for time. If we go to the next slide.
Sure.
We get into like mid to late 20th century, so John Sampson, Lynn Claude, Claude DeLong, Deborah Rickmeyer, Arno Bornkamp, and these are coming from both sides of the pond, from Europe and from America. The next slide, we start getting into some familiar names. We have Joseph Luloff, Jean-Yves Formeau, Nobuya Sagawa from Japan, Christopher Crevison. These are all people obviously most of you guys know and are familiar with their playing. The next slide, we get into Tim McAllister, Otis Murphy, Kenneth Che, Vincent David. And then the next slide, we should be getting into some classical chamber music. So I started off, I kind of divided this by countries. So, and I only did a couple. So obviously the French schools of quartets. So obviously Marcel Mule, that's one of the earliest recordings, is the Boats 1935. Check that out when you have a chance. Daniel Daffé, who was Marcel Mule's successor at the Paris Conservatory, had his own quartet, Jean-Yves Formeau. This is one of the quartets I started listening to back in the 90s. That was really heavily influenced. His French Masterpiece is a great album of standard literature. And then later on, Habanera Quartet, I think in the early 2000s, made a Mysterious Morning CD that was amazing, that a lot of people were influenced by. I think Jeff put Zazik, so I think you put that in. And I remember seeing those guys in person. They're amazing contemporary saxophone quartet group from France. The next slide is we have the two, what I consider the two premier Japanese quartets, Masato Kumoi, and then obviously the Trovera Quartet Sugawa. There are tons more. These are just a few. So don't. I'm missing quite a bit off this list. So this is just to kind of get you started and seeing some different styles. And then obviously we have the North American quartets. Some of you maybe should be familiar with. That's kind of why you're here with the H2 Quartet, Capital Quartet. And once again, if I left some off, don't be offended. There's so many great saxophone quartets.
This is by no means exhaustive at all.
Yes.
I actually I put on the last group on there, which is a group that many of you may not be aware of. They're called the Rova Quartet. They're kind of an interesting group. They're sort of similar. Some of you have maybe heard of the World Saxophone Quartet, which is more like of a jazz group. But Rova is a truly kind of crossover group. Like they play on. I don't know all that much about them, but they sound, some of them, like they have like more of a jazz sound, and they've done stuff like Terry Riley. They commissioned a huge Terry Riley piece, which no one plays. And they've got a bunch of other really interesting recordings and pieces that they've commissioned, but they don't really take a quote-unquote classical saxophone approach to the instrument, and they have a really interesting sound. Oh, they've done Fredericzewski's music as well. So I just thought I would put that on there along with other stuff. And then, of course, we have a couple other groups. The Roster Saxophone Quartet is hugely important to the development of the saxophone quartet repertoire. They can't be understated how much of a contribution they've made. Apollo Saxophone Quartet from Great Britain, and again, these are by no means exhaustive lists. These are just sort of suggestions on where to get started if you don't know where to go. So then we have our jazz recordings, which Jaymee was really helpful in putting together. Jaymee, do you want to kind of take us through these?
Yeah. So as far as just trying to organize it, I kind of did it by instrumentation. Now, obviously, several of these artists played more than just alto, tenor, and obviously soprano as well. But I kind of put them into categories of what they're most known for, or what they've done like the most recordings on. So I think 90% of jazz, of playing jazz, is just listening. And in the jazz tradition, it's primarily passed down orally. A lot of the details are not in the music that you're going to be reading, especially with articulation, style, swing. Like a lot of that stuff is just really difficult to notate. And so because there's so much music out there, and so many hundreds, thousands of tunes that have been written, you can take the same tune, and most, I would say like at least 60-70% of the artists on this entire list have recorded that tune.
Right.
And so what I've done here is I've listed some of their popular albums, and I went ahead and put the year it was recorded. And then on a few of them, pieces are like tunes and recordings that I know that are really good, that stand out, maybe something that I personally listen to a lot or that they're famous for. I've added in here. So like Lou Donaldson did this album. So his recording of Over the Rainbow actually has organ instead of piano. The whole album is like organ with the combo, which is actually really unique and interesting. And I wanted to try and make the berry list as extensive as I could, because I know a lot of people aren't familiar with good listenings for berry players. I mean, obviously Jerry Mulligan, and I think that Jerry more of his approach. He almost kind of, to me, sounds like more of a tenor player playing berry. He's a lot more melodic, as opposed to someone like Pepper Adams, who's got really bright and a lot more like edge to the sound. So I think, the berry list, I hope that helps some people out. It's pretty eclectic. But, and obviously, and even though this list is very long. This doesn't even come close to like covering everyone, you know, through the years. But so sorry if I offended anyone for leaving anything off.
There can never be a fully complete list. This is just suggestions to kind of get started. Um, and then I would, as I referenced earlier. Oh, what happened to?
I know.
Oh, okay, that's weird. As I referenced earlier, I'm a huge advocate. In fact, I admittedly myself spend not that much time listening to saxophone as I spend most of my time listening to other instrumentalists. And I just think for me the reason is because our instrument is fairly young and our pedagogy is also very young, and so I think that the development of other instruments has a lot to offer us in terms of where we can go with our own playing. So these are all just great artists that we would all recommend that you check out in terms of clarinetist, flutist, the whole wind family. We had to kind of stop ourselves when we were putting this together the other night because there's so many people that we can list, but these are some of the the heavy hitters in terms of their instruments in all different styles. Like for example, in the flute area, we've got great soloists like Jean-Pierre Rampal. We have orchestral players like Mathieu Dufour and Emmanuel Paoud. We just hosted Bartold Kukin at Florida State, who's pretty much the authority on Baroque flute playing. He was incredible player and an amazing scholar. And then, of course, Claire Chase is the founder of the ICE Ensemble and, kind of one of the standard bearers for the contemporary repertoire. So we tried to include as many different types of players as we could on here, but just to give you some ideas about where you can start and great players to know for sure. And I also wanted to mention that there's a couple of other quartets we didn't mention. Joe Luloff reminded me that the Noise Quartet featuring some great young players just came out with a new CD of some contemporary pieces by Marcos Balter and Dave Remenick and others. So definitely check that out. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you guys have anything to add here on the non-saxophone tip, but
yeah, especially all you guys who love playing transcriptions. Don't search for those of you who play what is it, the Three Romances by Robert Schumann. Don't look for a saxophone recording. Right. You should be listening to an oboe recording, obviously. So it's things like that I think seem pretty obvious, but maybe for the young saxophonist that maybe just isn't as obvious. But yeah, you should definitely, if you're going to play any sort of transcription, try to find the original instrument, a recording by a credible artist on that original instrument. It's important because, for instance, one example very quickly, I remember playing the Brahms Sonata, that for clarinet on saxophone, and I got criticized for my use of vibrato because clarinets don't use vibrato as much, and so it's just kind of things like that you should be aware of, and so you have to kind of decide whether you want to stay faithful to a good clarinet recording or maybe take a spin on it as a saxophonist and treat it more like a viola sonata or whatnot. So yeah, I think it's really very critical to listen to non-saxophone recordings.
And it's not to say that you have to, as we've been mentioning, it's not to say that you have to copy people exactly verbatim.
Right.
I've got one of the violinists that I added on to that violin list, Patricia Kopachinskaya, hopefully I'm saying that right, is well known for taking pieces by Mozart or Mendelssohn and adding her own composed cadenzas into them. She's famous for I think the Ligeti Concerto, her cadenza on that. She's an incredibly dynamic performer, but some people have not been all that happy with some of the cadenzas that she's added into some of the some of the standard repertoire. But you know what? That's how we innovate, and that's how we grow the instrument. So I think the bottom line here is that you want to take an informed approach to what you're doing. You don't want to just do something just because you're copying it, just because for no reason, right? You have to be informed and have a reason for doing what you're doing, I think, in the end. So, I think, yeah, we just have a few final thoughts here, most of which we've kind of talked about. If there's any questions We've had a couple people just ask for recommendations, which we just went over. And again, all this stuff is on the handout that's available on the website. But if you have any other questions, we can take those now. But our final thoughts, of course, are having to do with consulting your teachers for guidance, especially if you're younger, actively seeking those recommendations from people that you trust and that you might study with, and even your peers. There's always something new to discover. Listen with an open mind. Very, very important. And I totally agree with Johnny's last point that he put on here. Every recording, both good and bad, can teach and inform us on how to grow musically and improve our own playing, but only if we listen. I'm behind that for sure. Do you guys have any final thoughts or things to add in?
I think we covered it.
Okay.
We covered it, yeah.
Well, I hope this was really, really helpful for you guys and thinking about your listening. I think, just coming away from this, not only with just some recommendations of who to listen to, but just the idea of listening as a truly developing and ever-evolving practice is something that we just want to take away from this. And, it's time well spent and something that can be hugely important to our development. So hopefully it was helpful, and look forward to seeing you all at the next sessions. Thanks,
Great.
everybody.
All right, thanks. Have a good lunch break.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.